Thank you so much, Karen. I've got here this morning a piece of paper here. It's actually an invoice. It says North Carolina Quick Pass. It's an invoice with my name on it from the North Carolina Turnpike Authority. And just to give you a little bit of background about this, back in early August, I had gone to Cary, just outside of Raleigh. I was asked to speak at a chapel service for the staff of the State Baptist Convention. So I go to Cary that morning, I speak. Afterwards, I leave, and I'm using GPS to get me back home. And the GPS tells me to take this particular exit, but the signs indicate clearly that this is a toll road. Now, anytime I have ever been on a toll road before, generally it's been obviously out of state, and there are toll booths, there are machines, there's something that you go through where you actually put dollar bills in or change or whatever it is before you're able to even access that turnpike or that toll road. And so as I turn onto this road outside of Raleigh that's labeled as a toll road, I don't see any of those things. So I thought, well, maybe it's a little bit further down. And I continue to drive, and I'm only on it for, 2 to 3 miles, I suppose, when the GPS tells me to take the next exit. That puts me back on 40, headed back towards Greensboro. I thought, well, maybe I just wasn't on there long enough to get to a place where I would have to pay. I didn't give any thought to it until about 10 days ago. I get this envelope in the mail, and it says North Carolina Quick Pass Turnpike Authority, and honestly, my initial thought was this is some sort of junk mail. I didn't know that there was a North Carolina Turnpike Authority, but just out of sheer curiosity, I open it up, and this is what's inside. And there's a lovely little picture right here of my license plate. It's got the date and the time, and as I'm looking, it's all coming back to me that, oh yeah, this is that toll road. And I guess this is how they work, that there aren't booths, that they send you these things in the mail. And so it's an invoice, it's a bill that I'm supposed to pay, and do you know how much it is? 50 cents. Do you know how much a first-class stamp costs? 49. Isn't government great? You could argue that they spent 49 cents to make 50. But in truth, they're not making 50. Because aside from all the staffing costs and the equipment costs, the postage costs, this paper is not free. That envelope is not free, and so for them to bill me, they're actually losing money, right? My thought is that somebody would say, you know what? That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He was on that road for just such a short time to incur a 50-cent charge. It's just not worth the trouble. It's not worth the expense. Let's just kind of write that off and say, well, that just wasn't that big of a deal. It's not worth the trouble to respond to. Regularly we operate with that type of pragmatic mentality in play, don't we? And oftentimes that's the prudent thing to do. That's the wise thing to do. This is so insignificant, it doesn't warrant our trouble, it doesn't warrant the expense, it doesn't warrant the time. It's just not worth the trouble, it's no big deal, so I'm just not going to deal with that. Oftentimes, that's, again, a prudent, wise thing to do. Unfortunately, all too easily, what we can do is to carry that same sense of pragmatism over to spiritual things, and when that happens, very easily, we can make a real mess of things. You say, well, what do you mean? Well, let me see if I can explain it to you today out of 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1, if you would, open your Bibles there with me. And if you didn't bring a Bible with you, I hope that you'll grab one from the pew rack or scoot next to someone who has a Bible and who smells tolerable to you. But it's important for each of us to see the pages of God's Word, because nothing I say today is as important as what God has said here. 1 Peter chapter 1, starting with verse 13, Peter says this, "Therefore gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lusts as in your ignorance. But as He who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, Be holy, for I am holy." All right, just 4 short verses. What I'd like to do first is just kind of to walk you through this so that we understand what it is that Peter is saying. He begins by talking about girding up the loins of your mind. A 21st century audience doesn't understand that remotely as easily as Peter's first century audience would have. To help understand that, you got to keep in mind what it is that people were wearing at this point. And both men and women would have been wearing long, flowing garments, robes, cloaks, that type of thing. And even though women's robes probably would have been longer, both men and women have a lot of fabric down at their legs. And that's fine. That's not a problem unless you're doing something that's a bit more physically demanding. Let's say you need to jump over a fence. Or let's say you want to do something just crazy like running. Right? Crazy, right? Anyway, so you decide, I need to run. Well, all of a sudden, this excess fabric or scaling a fence, that becomes more of a problem because it's getting in the way. It impedes your mobility. It impedes your freedom of movement, and it causes you and makes you more prone or more likely to stumble, to fall. And so what people would do is to take the front part of that robe and they would raise it up and tuck it into their belt, their sash, whatever type of instrument they would have around their waist, to tuck that in, and then all of a sudden the fabric is out of the way, and you're not going to trip, you're not going to stumble. That was called girding up your loins. But Peter doesn't say gird up your loins, he says gird up the loins of your mind. And he's using and appealing to that imagery to convey, I believe, this thought. That anything that may cause your thoughts, your mind to stumble, any type of thought that you could entertain that would trip you up, you need to get that out of the way. And he fleshes it out even further by saying be sober, which is to say be vigilant, be clear-minded in terms of your focus, because you are to focus on something. What's that? He says your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. If you're looking at an NIV translation this morning, that probably helps you a bit more in understanding what he says. The NIV renders it this way, that we should focus fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed. What Peter is alluding to, what he's referencing, is the point at some point in the future when Jesus is universally understood and recognized by all and by everyone as actually being the Christ. That's at some point in the future. And so he's talking in general terms about prophecy, about the return of Jesus. You could argue, well, why is it that he is talking about that? Without falling into or getting stuck in the weeds to go over all the intricacies of biblical prophecy, let me see if I can just, in a very short few statements, put in a nutshell biblical prophecy for you. You ready? God created a perfect world, and He put in it perfect people. But those perfect people sinned and messed everything up. And their sin has affected that perfect world so that paradise was lost, and all those that followed them, and the world itself was adversely affected by sin. Paradise was lost, and since then everything has been messed up. But one day, Jesus is coming back. Paradise lost will become paradise restored. And what we have for so long made wrong, He will ultimately make right. And all those who know Him, all those who are His followers, will spend eternity with Him. It's a little simpler than comparing Daniel and Revelation, isn't it? But that in broad brushstrokes, that's the story of biblical prophecy. Why, though, is Peter talking about, why is he referencing in some way, even in a general sense, the return of Jesus? Well, I believe the reason is pretty simple, and it becomes very clear if you think about what's going on for Peter's audience. This is a first century Christian audience. If you're a Christian in the first century, life for you is not easy. And it's not merely that people are saying less than nice things or people are calling you derogatory words. If you're a Christian in the first century, it is very likely that some of these things are going to be experienced by you. That somebody, or maybe multiplied people, will physically accost you, that they will beat you. It's entirely possible, if not in fact likely, that you could spend time in prison for an undetermined length of time. It's possible that you may be executed. Why? Because you're a follower of Jesus, and that's it. Things for them were very difficult, and consequently, you've got to think that these first century believers were frightened. They were scared. They're apprehensive. They're weary. They're fatigued. They're discouraged. They're all of these things, and perhaps thinking about walking away from this whole Jesus thing, considering the prospect of maybe abandoning this whole Christian thing. And so Peter talks about girding up the loins of your mind. Don't get stuck in the weeds. Remove the thoughts that may prevent you from maintaining your focus on what? This event that lies in the future. What he's trying to do and what he's calling them to do is to keep the long view in mind. Because very easily all they could do is get trapped in focusing on the challenges of the moment. And so he's saying to them, listen, it's not going to always be this way. Put your hope on that day. Put your hope in that Jesus who is going to make all that is now wrong. One day he's going to make right. This has a consequence that you see is in verse 14, that you operate as obedient children. And further he describes that as those that do not conform themselves to the former lusts, as in your ignorance. I don't know how many of you have given a whole lot of thought to the fact that when my family is here on Sunday mornings, Caroline very much operates like a single mom. And it's not by virtue of choice, it's just kind of how things operate. Because of my obligations before, during, and after the service, there's so much related to the dealing with our children that she is responsible for. And so she's the one that gets Catherine to the nursery and gets the boys to their Sunday school classes. After Sunday school, she's the one that gets them out of their classes, gets Catherine checked in for the nursery during the service. She brings the boys in here with them, and she's the one that sits with them during the service, whether in its entirety or up until kids' life begins. Now, there have been some instances and occasions, even just this past year, where we had some problems being able to do that. Let's say, for example, Catherine woke up on a Sunday morning and she's got a fever. She's sick. She can't come to church. She's 3 years old, and she's not fit to be able to stay at home by herself. We've tried it a few times, and she just tears up the place. No, but at 3 years old and she's sick, she can't stay at home by herself. But Caroline is going to stay with her. And so we'll talk about it. And each time we decide, we hate for the boys to miss, I will bring them. And so I get them to their Sunday school class afterwards, make sure that they get in here in the sanctuary. And if you haven't paid attention, until I get up to preach, I sit over here to my left and your right over on the front row. On those particular Sundays, the boys would be in here with me. And even if it's a Sunday where Kids Life is going to meet, and at that point they're only in the service for about the first third of the time, there are still some instances where I have to come up on the platform, either to do a welcome, to do a prayer, to do something, or just to come up here and look pretty, right? So I've got to leave 3 boys seated on the front row where they are clearly in view of any that want to look and see them perhaps misbehave. In all honesty, and it was just recently that we had to do this, I was not a bit concerned about them fussing with each other. I wasn't concerned about them fighting. I wasn't concerned with them misbehaving during those times that I was up on the platform. I really honestly was not. Now, it hasn't always been that way. If you were to back it up 2 years, take 2 years of age off of each of them, I wouldn't leave them there for a moment. But at this point, they're old enough. They have interacted with us enough. They have been disciplined enough. They understand the expectation enough where now we can say, and I can say, I am perfectly comfortable with them sitting there and expecting them to do just fine because now they know better. Now they know better. It hasn't always been that way, but now it is they know better. Well, you take that back into what Peter is describing here. That really is his point. Before you or I or any become a follower of Christ, there are lots of things that we did or could have done, whether in deed or in thought. Plenty of behaviors that we engaged in for no other reason than the fact that we simply wanted to. But since becoming a follower of Jesus, we begin to have some difficulty in continuing to engage in those things. Many of those things we stop. Habits that might have had get changed. Ways in which you spoke or entertained yourself. How you might have spent time or money. Those things are very different now. Why? Because once you come to know Christ, at this point now, you know better. You know better. That's what he's saying, that you're operating as obedient children, not conforming to how you used to when you were ignorant. Before you knew better, now you're operating as obedient children because you know better. And that leads us to the climax of this passage, which we see in verses 15 and 16, where he says, "As he," that's God who called you, "is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct." You know, the Bible makes clear a slew of different attributes that are true of God, and regularly we talk about these, and the majority of them are pretty easy for us to get our arms around, that we've got a real handle on what that means. For example, when we talk about God's omniscience, we're saying the fact that He knows everything. There's nothing unknowable or not known by Him. Well, we can get that. Or if we speak of the fact that God is omnipotent, that He's all-powerful, we're saying of Him that there's nothing that He seeks to do for which He lacks the ability to do it. There's no deficiency in power. Now, those attributes, we can kind of get our arms around those. Those make sense to us. But when we start talking about, for example, what Peter references here, the holiness of God, that's a little more difficult for us to kind of quantify. It's a term that a lot of times we use, but we don't give a whole lot of thought as to what it actually means when we speak of the fact that God is holy. I think one of the reasons is because this is a term that I believe involves more than just a single thing. I think, first of all, it speaks to the fact that God is really, really clean. And by that, I don't mean that God smells nice. I mean that there is no sin, there is no stain of guilt, there is no wrong deed for which God is bearing any stain. He is absolutely, completely, and totally morally pure. You say, okay, I get that. I can subscribe to that. But holiness speaks more than about just God's cleanness, His moral purity. It seems that it says something else, and I believe if we think about, in particular, the temple in the Old Testament, it makes a little bit more sense. You remember that the temple was described as itself being holy, conveying the idea that it was set apart from all the other buildings and structures. And if you remember at all, that there was an outer courtyard where any could go to, and then there was the holy place, as you advance further into the temple, where priests could go. But then there was this one spot that was reserved not simply for any priest, but the high priest, and only he could go in there only one day a year on the Day of Atonement. It was the Holy of Holies. It was the most holy place. And that use of the word holy, it's not just speaking about the absence of sin, but it's communicating something about how it's distinct, that it's set apart, that it's unique from any and set apart from everything else. When we speak of the holiness of God, we're speaking of His absolute moral purity, but we're also speaking about how it is that He's set apart from any and everything else. Now, with that in mind, Peter says, as God who has called you is holy, as He is morally pure, as He is set apart and distinct, so I am expected to be holy in all of my conduct. You are to be holy in all of your conduct. He makes it even more plain as he quotes from several passages in Leviticus, where the Lord says this, "Be ye holy, you be holy, as I am holy." So in short, the expectation is this. How God is, well, you're supposed to be like that. Now, very easily you could hear that, you could read these words and say, okay, Michael, I believe that's correct. What you're describing, I believe that's an appropriate interpretation, unpacking of the Scripture. That's clearly what the expectation is. And after hearing that, you say, well, that's an impossible challenge because I'm not God. There's no vacancies for that position. I'm not going to be God, so there's no use in me pretending, whether before Him, before myself, or anybody else. Well, if that's your thought, before you tune me or you tune out this passage, let me give you a few thoughts that I think will help us as we apply what Peter is saying here. Here's the first one. When it comes to sin, you do not need advanced degrees. When it comes to sin, you do not need advanced degrees. This is what I mean by that. There are, and I am supportive of so many of the different venues in which you and I, as followers of Christ, can come to greater understanding about the Bible, about God, about His expectations of us. And there are slews of different avenues from which you can learn. I mean, you can go to Lifeway bookstore when it opens tomorrow, and there are thousands of different titles. Not all of them are good, not all of them are beneficial, but there are slews of them that are. In the course of the history of publication, there are literally millions of Christian books that have been written that in varying degrees that can be very affirming and very encouraging and very enlightening and very beneficial to you. Now, apart from the books that exist, there's colleges and seminaries. There are different formal institutions, whether in person or online. You could learn, you could take some classes, either formally or to audit them. There's those types of resources. Beyond that, there's always, whether locally, regionally, or nationally, some sort of conference, some sort of seminar that you can go to where you can learn more. Beyond that, here at Gate City, as is true of most local churches, there are regular opportunities, whether it's Sunday school or an additional small or large group study, where you can avail yourself of more teaching, more information, so that you can deepen your understanding. You can come to know more and understand more about God, about the Bible, about what He expects of you. In the scheme of things, I'm supportive of all those things, provided we don't pay more attention to what an author said as compared to what God has said. All right? In the scheme of things, those are positive avenues that can be pursued. When we have this expectation, though, and this mandate to be holy as God is holy, first of all, that says something about our behavior. Just as there is no stain of sin in God, He expects our behavior to be in the same manner. And when we're talking about sin, we're not talking about complicated stuff, are we? In all honesty, we're not. We're talking about things where God said, do this and not do that. That doesn't require excessive research. That doesn't require lengthy investigation. It doesn't require getting another course, going to another seminar, taking another class, reading another book. It doesn't require that. We're talking about something very simple. In fact, in the Bible, God has given to us a lot of those rules relative to sin, hasn't He? He said, do this, not do that. So not only is the Bible available to us, but the Bible makes plain something else. In Romans chapter 2, verse 15, God through Paul says this, and it's true of every person that does or has or ever will live, and that is that God has written His law on the hearts of people. All people. Lost people, saved people, all people have the law of God written on their hearts. See, I never really thought about that. And that every single person that comes into this world has a basic sense of what is and is not right and wrong without ever having to be taught. That's interesting. But I believe that our own experience bears witness to that. I don't know how many established nations there are throughout the world. It's less than 200, but let's say there's 200 governments around the world. Now, one of the things that makes you a government is that you've got territory that you're responsible for. There are citizens that are a part of that particular country. But beyond that, there are laws. Each country has different laws. I don't know if you've ever given thought to this, but if you take let's say 200 nations of the world and you amass and put together all of their laws, there's going to be a lot of different technicalities that are different based on the various jurisdictions. But are you aware of the fact that there is going to be a core set of laws that's going to be the same, universally found in each code of law? For example, each of these countries is going to have a law against taking innocent life. There's going to be laws against murder, regardless of the language, regardless of the skin color, regardless of the culture, regardless of how new or old the country is. There's going to be that. There's going to be laws against stealing, taking that which does not belong to you. There's going to be laws on the books against rape. Isn't that interesting? That regardless of where that country is on the planet, regardless of the language that's spoken, regardless of the racial or ethnic background, there's going to be a core set of laws that is universally found. Why is that? Let me tell you why it is. Because as people, we're operating with how we have been made. God says that we have all been made with His law written on our hearts. It should therefore come as no surprise that universally, whether these are pagan countries or these are theocracies, regardless of the language, regardless of any of those things, there's going to be a common set of rules that are understood as being right and wrong because that's how we are made. Well, what I'm saying in short is this. Again, when it comes to sin, you and I do not need advanced degrees. Not only do we have this book that describes for us plenty of things where we are to do and not to do, it's even etched on our hearts. We come into this world with an awareness without ever being taught things that are right and things that are wrong. And so when God erects this standard for holiness, it's not as if you have to go blindly living, blindly operating, saying, I don't know whether is this. It's already there. It's on the pages of His Word. It's even etched in your heart. When it comes to sin, you don't need advanced degrees, but beyond that, as a logical extension of it, when it comes to sin, you know better. When it comes to sin, you know better. Last week, I guess 2 weeks ago, I had to change a commode out in our bathroom. I had gone in there one day and noticed that apparently, and I think that commode was original to the house, was put in 1961, and at some point, somehow, there developed a fine hairline crack in the tank itself. And so it wasn't a lot of water, but a steady drip. And you don't fix a crack like that. You just replace the commode. So I go to Lowe's, and I buy a new commode, and I bring it home. And do you know what I did not do? This may come as a surprise to you. I did not ask Nathan. I did not ask Philip. I did not even ask Andrew to put that commode in. I didn't say, here's the tool bag, go install that bad boy. I did not do that. Do you know why? Because they don't know the first thing about putting a commode in. They don't even know the first thing about raising and lowering a seat. I did not ask them to do that because they know nothing about that. I did it because I know how to do that. They are, and it's not that they are foolish. It's not that they are dumb. It's just that they are ignorant about that. And a lot of times ignorance sounds like a very negative word, but in truth it's neutral. I mean, ignorance just means that you simply do not know. Putting that thought back into what we're talking about, what Peter's speaking of here, we come to this reality. When it comes to sin, you and I know better. Now, it's easy to look at this command to be holy, to be free from any wrong as God is, and say, well, that's just simply impossible. And do not misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that any of us is going to be able to do this perfectly, but we can be, and we should be making significant strides in that direction. And that can be possible when we remind ourselves of this fact. I already know what it is that I should be and should not be doing. It's not like I need more knowledge. It's not like I need more understanding. It's not like I need more truth. I just need to start practicing the truth I already know. Because when it comes to sin, I know better. I'm not locked into it. When it comes to sin, you know better. You're not locked into it. There's a final application, which is this. When it comes to living, you've got a different standard. When it comes to living, you've got a different standard. I don't know if you've ever given consideration to this thought, but I believe I'm correct in this. Our entire lives throughout the course of the day are constantly lived in a state of almost unending comparison. Virtually every assessment that you make is done in the context of comparison. For example, I can say, my car is dirty. You know why I say my car is dirty? Because when I park it next to yours, There's a lot of stuff on mine that is not on yours. And so because of that comparison, I can say, my car is dirty. What you think about your hairstyle, whether it looks really good or really bad, whether it's up to date or it's very traditional, whether it's whatever. Your assessment of your hairstyle, whether that's good or bad, that assessment is based on what? How you compare it to other people's. So if you're here this morning and think, my hair looks good, it's because you think compared to everybody else's, yeah, your hair looks good. When it comes to cooking, whether you view yourself to be a good cook, a bad cook, or an okay cook, that's based on your comparison to other family and friends or restaurants where you have had their food. I mean, you might have thought or been operating under the premise, I'm a terrible cook, but then you go to the hospital and you have hospital food, and you think, I'm a gourmet chef, right? Because of the comparison. Because of the comparison. You think you weigh too much, too little, or about right because you're comparing your weight to what you see everybody else. Our lives are constantly lived in a state of comparison. You get that. You understand that. What I want you to further understand is this. Until the time a person comes to know Christ, their only standard of comparison is to other people. Until the time a person comes to know Christ, their only comparison is towards other people. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, if you were to begin a conversation with any random lost person, a perfect stranger to you, but somebody that does not yet know Christ. And suppose in the course of conversation you can be intentional about directing the conversation till finally you can ask this question. Hey, do you think of yourself as being a good person? Would you say that you live a good life? Now, if you ask that question, you're going to get a slew of different responses. But those responses, what will they be based on? Well, how that person compares themselves to others. Compared to their mean and nasty boss, they may say, I'm a really nice, gracious person. Compared to their lying neighbor, they say, I'm a pretty honest person. Compared to their philandering friend, they'd say, I'm very faithful. Compared to Richard Pryor, my language is pretty clean. Their assessments would be based exclusively on their comparison to others. And again, understand that until such time a person becomes a follower of Christ, that is their only standard of comparison. But when a person crosses the threshold of faith and begins to follow Jesus, they've got a different standard. Jesus becomes the new standard. The problem is this: it's tough to break the old habit. It's tough to stop comparing yourself to other people and beginning to compare yourself to Jesus. Consequently, I believe regularly as professing Christians, we consistently and all too often squelch out the conviction of the Holy Spirit. We tamp down the warnings of our conscience that have the law of God etched upon it, and find ourselves engaged in all sorts of behaviors that we should not be for this simple reason. We're continuing to compare ourselves to other people and what they are doing. That's why what Peter says should strike us as being so very different. That's why these words and this admonishment should be so striking. Just like the one who called you is holy, you be holy in all your conduct. As He is holy, you be holy. He's your standard. In many ways, this message comes to you as a follow-up from what we dealt with last week. And the premise is pretty simple. And that is that when we start dealing or talking about sin, in particular sin in our own hearts, it's very easy for us to say, it's just no big deal. No big deal. Regularly, it seems that we're operating with this premise in mind. How much sin can I engage in before it actually becomes a problem? Now, at what point do I actually have to deal with this? And when playing that game, we very easily begin to rationalize our behavior, compare it to others, and come up with an assessment effectively like I do with the Turnpike Authority. Well, it's just so small, it's so insignificant, it's just not worth the trouble. But that question, how much sin can I engage in before it becomes a problem, I suppose is actually a different form of this question. How much sin can I be comfortable with? How much sin can I be comfortable with? I believe Peter is asking us to ask ourselves a very, very different question. In my life, in your life, how much sin is God comfortable with? Maybe it is a big deal after all. Will you bow your heads with me? I know very easily we get into this routine, and I'm not saying that I don't do it. I think we all do it. And that's where we're comparing ourselves to other people, and sometimes we can pat ourselves on the back because we say, that person's doing this. Thankfully, I'm not. I'm really doing well. I'm not doing what they're doing.